The levels of the registry archives held a permanent chill that no hearth could completely banish. Evelyn sat at the furthest drafting table, her posture rigid, her breathing shallow, letting the rhythmic scratching of her quill serve as her only anchor in the dim room. The air tasted of beeswax, damp stone, and centuries of decaying parchment. She was supposed to be cross-referencing the border taxation logs for Mora, the archive keeper, whose gruff demands for absolute accuracy usually meant Evelyn stayed long past midnight, but the document resting beneath her ink-stained fingers was not a tax record. It was the Vance family ledger. The heavy book lay open under the sputtering light of a single tallow candle. Its cracked leather binding felt like freezing iron against the delicate skin of her wrists. She did not touch the center of the brittle pages. She only stared at the fresh entries recorded at the very back, where the historical lineage normally concluded. The handwriting was sweeping, aggressive, and undeniably familiar. Garrick had not just seized the border properties, he had forged a binding administrative decree, backdating the signatures to the week her father had died. She read the specific clauses, her eyes tracing the exact formulation of the Northern Registry law. Transfer of the estate, transfer of legal guardianship over Pip, and, stamped at the bottom with a fraudulent witness seal, a formal marriage contract binding her to Garrick. The realization settled in her chest like a stone dropping through still water. Slow, thorough, filling every crack, Garrick did not just want her family's remaining influence. He wanted her trapped in a legal framework where she would have no right to speak, no right to travel, and no right to protect her vulnerable brother. The contract was absolute. If she remained in the keep until morning, the dawn bells would make the document public, and the transition of power would become irreversible law. She did not gasp. She did not sweep the stacks of fraudulent paper off the desk in a blind panic. That kind of reaction belonged to women who had safety nets to catch them when they fell. Evelyn had only herself. Instead, she looked at the glass inkwell resting beside her right hand. Her fingers were trembling. It was a fine, continuous tremor, betraying the sheer physiological terror she was fighting to suppress. Very carefully, she picked up the brass cap. She aligned the threads of the lid with the grooves of the glass bottle, her hands shaking so badly she had to brace her wrist against the heavy wood of the desk. She screwed the cap shut until it locked perfectly. A spilled drop of ink would leave a traceable stain on the ledger. A stain would prove to Garrick that she had been sitting at this specific desk discovering his specific crime. She needed a silent exit, not a dramatic confession. She slid the Vance family ledger back into the exact center of its designated shelf, ensuring the dust pattern remained undisturbed. Then, she pulled her heavy wool cloak from the back of her chair and walked toward the iron-reinforced door of the archives. The northern storm had turned the outer courtyard into a chaotic expanse of freezing mud and impenetrable grey rain. Evelyn slipped through the side postern, keeping her shoulder pressed tight against the rough stone wall of the keep. The wind was a bitter, howling force, immediately soaking the hem of her cloak and driving the cold deep into her bones. She needed to reach the lower town transit line. She needed to get Pip out of the territory before Garrick submitted the documents to the morning court. Through the relentless sheets of downpour, she saw the silhouette of a carriage idling near the western gate. It was completely black, lacking the usual brass identification lanterns of the public transit fleet, but the horses were harnessed and standing ready in the mud. In the dark and the driving rain, it was a vehicle moving away from the keep. That was all that mattered. She did not hesitate. Pulling her hood lower over her face, she waded through the ankle-deep sludge, grabbed the cold iron handle of the carriage door, and hauled herself up the steps. She slipped inside and immediately pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind her, cutting off the deafening roar of the storm. The interior was completely dark, save for the faint ambient light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. It was deeply warm. The space smelled intensely of dried cedar, cold leather, and something much sharper. It was the scent of ozone right before a lightning strike, heavy and thick, pressing against her lungs. Evelyn reached back to ensure the latch had caught, seeking the familiar shape of a standard transit handle. Before her fingers could find the metal, a heavy mechanical mechanism engaged from within the frame. It was a distinct, final sound, the heavy thud of a steel deadbolt sliding into an iron housing. She froze, her hand suspended in the dark. The shadows on the opposite leather bench shifted. The carriage was not empty. A man sat across from her, entirely unbothered by her sudden, frantic intrusion. He did not lunge. He did not raise his voice to demand her name. He simply sat in the shadows. Darius Vorn occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He leaned forward just enough for the faint, grey light of the window to catch his hands. He was resting his elbows on his knees, his posture relaxed but utterly immovable. Between his thumb and index finger, he was slowly, deliberately rolling a massive cold iron ring. The royal sovereign seal. Evelyn stopped breathing. She recognized the emblem instantly, the reigning king of the Northern Territory. The man who dictated the very laws Garrick was manipulating. He did not look angry. He looked entirely calculated, his dark eyes analyzing the wet, shivering woman who had just barricaded herself inside his private transport. He did not reach for her. He simply let the mechanical finality of the locked door make his statement for him. "You are not leaving," Darius said. His voice was a low, measured hum that vibrated through the floorboards of the carriage, offering no threat, only absolute, undeniable fact. Evelyn did not scream at his absolute decree or the finality of the iron lock. She had spent too much of her life managing the bureaucratic machinations of aggressive men to waste her breath on panic. Instead, she let her eyes adjust to the dim, shifting light inside the cabin. The interior smelled of beeswax, wet wool, and the sharp scent of cold cedar. She braced her muddy boots against the polished floorboards as the vehicle lurched forward through the torrential rain. Her gaze moved to the door. The cast-iron handle was secured by a complex tumbler mechanism that had dropped into place with a hollow metallic thud. It was a drop-bar lock, heavy and absolute. Evelyn recognized the design from the archival vaults she managed in the lower city. Impossible to force from the inside without a steel lever. Rain lashed against the window pane in violent sheets, blurring the dark courtyard outside into smeared streaks of grey. Evelyn pressed her bare fingertips against the freezing surface. The glass was thick, reinforced with a layer of hardened resin to withstand stray arrows. She traced the beveled edge with her thumb, feeling the vibration of the wheels rolling heavily over cobblestone. Breaking it would require immense, blunt force. She mentally measured the weight of the brass lantern, bolted to the wall against the density of the pane. The structural damage to her hands would be severe, likely shattering her knuckles. Even if the glass gave way, jumping from a fast-moving carriage onto wet stone offered a low probability of a successful escape. A broken leg would simply leave her paralyzed in the mud, waiting for Garrick Thorne's men to retrieve her for the forced marriage ceremony. The math was clear. The physical cost far outweighed the tactical benefit. It wasn't worth the risk. She withdrew her hand and folded it neatly over the Vance family ledger resting in her lap. She sat back against the dark velvet cushions, straightening her spine until her posture was impeccable. Silence settled between the two occupants of the carriage, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the relentless drumming of rain. The king commanded the quiet with absolute ease, feeling no compulsion to shatter it with words. He sat in the shadows opposite her, a motionless silhouette wrapped in a dark woolen cloak. His breathing was slow and measured. He was not gloating over her confinement. He was simply waiting for her to finish her assessment. "You have concluded that the door is unyielding," he said finally. His voice was a low, resonant drawl that carried easily over the storm outside. It did not hold the sharp edge of a threat, but rather a factual observation from a man who appreciated structural integrity. Evelyn met his gaze in the dim, flickering lantern light. "I have concluded that breaking the glass would compromise my ability to hold a quill," she corrected calmly, "and my hands are currently my only valuable asset. Damaging them for a failed exit is a poor tactical choice." He tilted his head slightly, a gesture of genuine acknowledgement. A practical assessment, and entirely accurate. "I am not in the habit of holding women against their will," the sovereign continued. He kept his empty hands visible, resting them lightly on his knees. It was a deliberate posture, designed to give her absolute spatial autonomy. The lock was not engaged to keep you confined inside. It was engaged to keep them out. Evelyn watched him carefully, her fingers tightening on the damp cover of her ledger. "Them. Rogue guards," Darius clarified, his tone shifting into the precise cadence of an administrator delivering a briefing. "Loyal to Garrick, operating entirely outside the sanctioned municipal chain of command. They have cordoned off the lower transit lines and are searching every public coach, leaving the city limits. They are looking for a woman traveling alone with a stolen ledger." She felt a cold spike of adrenaline lodge between her ribs, but forced her breathing to remain perfectly even. If they are searching the transit lines, stopping this carriage is only a matter of time. Garrick controls the militia, and they will not hesitate to halt any transport moving toward the border. "They will not stop this carriage," the king replied. He reached beneath his cloak and withdrew a heavy, cold iron signet ring, holding it up so the amber light caught the intricate crest, the royal sovereign seal. By the strict definitions of the border treaty, this vehicle is classified as sovereign territory. Local mercenaries cannot legally touch you while you remain within these walls. Evelyn studied the dull iron seal, letting the complex legal implications settle in her mind. A physical space defined not by wood and metal, but by absolute law. Law was a language she could navigate, a structure she had spent years exploiting to keep Pip safe from corrupt magistrates. The idea that this rolling wooden box was a floating island of sovereign immunity was a brilliant tactical maneuver. "If Garrick's men ignore the seal," Evelyn pointed out, testing the boundaries of his authority, "they will simply block the road." A legal treaty does not stop a physical barricade of armed men. Darius did not flinch. "A barricade against a royal carriage is an act of treason," he stated, his voice carrying the terrifying weight of absolute authority. "Garrick relies on administrative loopholes to steal inheritances. He is not stupid enough to commit open treason against the crown. He prefers fraud to war." She absorbed the truth of that statement. Garrick thrived in the grey areas of bureaucracy. He would never risk a direct military confrontation with the sovereign king over a runaway archivist. "So I am trapped," she said quietly, passing the reality of her situation. "But I am legally safe. You are a protected guest," Darius corrected, lowering the ring. "If you step outside this door, you immediately forfeit that protection. You become an undocumented citizen on contested ground, subject to arrest by any local marshal holding a forged warrant. Inside this cabin, however, you are under my direct administrative oversight. No one will lay a hand on you." The absolute certainty in his voice was disconcerting. Evelyn was accustomed to men who used volume, anger, or physical intimidation to establish dominance. Men who threw ledgers across rooms and shouted down clerks to get their way. This man used jurisprudence. He wielded geography and treaty clauses with the same precision a soldier might wield a blade. "And what happens when we reach the mountain pass?" Evelyn asked, keeping her tone strictly practical, refusing to let him see her relief. She kept her hands tightly laced over the stolen register. Jurisdiction technically shifts at the toll gate. Jurisdiction expands where I decree it expands, he answered simply. He did not lean forward. He did not crowd her space. He merely sat in the cool shadows, watching her with dark, intelligent eyes. Until we reach the high keep, you will remain seated exactly where you are. Not as my prisoner, Evelyn. As an administrative necessity. The leather interior of the carriage smelled of ozone and damp wool, undercut by the sharp tang of wet pine needles carried in on their coats. Outside, the storm continued to batter the reinforced wooden roof, a relentless drumming that threatened to drown out rational thought. Evelyn did not allow the noise to dictate her breathing. Panic was a luxury she had left behind in the freezing mud of the courtyard. She reached for the stiff leather straps of her travel briefcase, her fingers steady despite the ambient chill seeping through the floorboards. Darius remained seated on the opposite bench. He did not speak. His stillness was not the predatory waiting of an alpha seeking a weakness, but rather the quiet containment of a sovereign observing his territory. Evelyn appreciated the restraint. It allowed her to pull the brass latches of her satchel open without feeling the need to justify her actions. The carriage took a sharp, swaying turn around a mountain bend, threatening to send her unencored belongings spilling across the velvet. She did not gasp. She made no move to grasp the king's arm to steady herself, nor did she brace against the door. Instead, she adjusted her posture, lowering her center of gravity against the firm cushions. From the depths of the case, she retrieved a small, reinforced wooden ink box. It was a modest thing, scored with the marks of daily administrative use, holding 3 tightly sealed glass inkpots and a bundle of trimmed quills. Another violent jolt rocked the cabin. Evelyn calmly shifted her left foot, pressing the wooden box firmly into the narrow gap between her mud-caked boots. The makeshift wedge held the box perfectly secure against the swaying carriage floor. She opened the wooden lid. The acidic scent of iron gall ink drifted up, mingling with the cold air. She began to check the cork stoppers, pressing each one down with her thumb to ensure the violent ride had not loosened them. This was the work of an archivist. It was methodical, predictable, and immune to the chaos of rogue guards. Darius watched her hands. He noted the permanent ink stains ingrained in the ridges of her knuckles, the absolute absence of trembling as she aligned a brass-nibbed quill beside the glassed pots. She was not crying over her ruined dress. She was simply ensuring her tools were intact. The king leaned back against the dark upholstery, the tension in his broad shoulders easing just a fraction. He recognized unyielding competence when he saw it, and he respected it far more than any display of fragile tears. With her writing implements stabilized on the floor, Evelyn reached deeper into the satchel. The air in the compartment seemed to grow heavier as she withdrew her family's heavy volume. It was a massive, leather-bound register, its edges frayed from decades of meticulous administrative handling. The heavy book smelled of dry parchment, binding glue, and old dust, a stark sensory contrast to the chaotic storm outside. She set the heavy spine onto her lap, balancing the weight across her knees as the carriage ground over the unpaved road. "If I am to remain under your jurisdiction," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but remarkably clear over the sound of the rain, "then you should know exactly what kind of liability you are presently transporting." Darius shifted his gaze from her steady hands to the massive book. He made no move to take the book from her grasp. He simply waited, respecting her ownership of the object, allowing her to present the evidence on her own terms. Evelyn unclasped the heavy brass lock of the register. She turned past the initial family birth records, the dry pages rustling loudly in the enclosed space. She stopped at a section dated exactly 3 months prior. "Darius Vorn claims a legal right to my inheritance, and by extension, my mandatory compliance in marriage." The regional magistrates approved the transfer of the estate. She pointed an ink-stained finger to a dense block of script near the bottom margin. But the dates of the provincial transit decrees do not align with the High Keep's official trade schedules. She turned the ledger so it faced him, sliding it carefully across the small gap between their knees without bridging the physical distance. Darius leaned forward. He withdrew the royal sovereign seal from the inner pocket of his dark wool coat. The heavy cold iron signet ring gleamed faintly in the dim, flickering light of the carriage lantern. Darius lowered the iron edge of the seal against the parchment. He used the flat metal rim to trace the meticulous lines of handwriting, his movements deliberate and entirely unhurried. The cold iron glided just below the ink, drawing his sharp focus to the exact administrative discrepancy Evelyn had found: the forged taxation dates, the suspiciously missing excise stamps, the fraudulent signatures that had bypassed the sovereign's oversight entirely to grant Thorn unchecked regional authority. The ink thickness, Darius murmured, his low voice vibrating through the narrow space. It is perfectly uniform here, but heavily pooled in the magistrate's signature. A secondary forgery, Evelyn confirmed, letting the cold fact settle into the silence between them. Thorn did not just steal my family's estate. He fabricated a jurisdictional loophole right under the nose of the sovereign court, using false ledgers to secure land that belongs to the crown. Darius kept the iron ring pressed against the page. He did not express sudden outrage. He did not threaten physical violence against Thorn. Instead, his dark eyes lifted from the parchment to meet hers, reading the calculated defiance in her posture. She had not come to him begging for charity. She had brought him the documentation needed to legally dismantle a corrupt provincial leader. The ledger was not a desperate plea for rescue. It was a tactical weapon against systemic fraud, and she was calmly handing him the hilt. The carriage hit a deep rut in the mud-slicked road, the heavy chassis swaying violently on its leather suspension before settling back into a steady, grinding rhythm. Evelyn kept her hands resting lightly over the damp cover of the massive book, feeling the intense vibration of the iron-banded wheels traveling up through the floorboards and into her boots. She watched Darius carefully. Having finished reviewing the ink-stained entries of Garrick's fraud, the sovereign now turned his attention to the immediate physical reality of their route north. He leaned slightly toward the left window panel. The thick glass was entirely fogged over, a heavy layer of condensation built up from the severe temperature difference between the freezing's autumn deluge outside and the enclosed, pressurized warmth of the cabin. Darius did not summon a parchment map from a leather tube, nor did he call for his driver to halt so they could consult a navigator. Instead, he simply lifted his right hand. With the tip of a leather-clad finger, he began to draw directly onto the clouded pane. "We are currently here," Darius said, his voice dropping into a low, measured register that cut cleanly through the drumming rain on the roof. He traced a steady, horizontal line across the moisture, representing the main artery of the sovereign road. "This is royal jurisdiction. As long as our wheels remain in motion on this specific stretch of paved stone, my authority over this vehicle is absolute. We are legally classified as a diplomatic transport." Evelyn leaned forward just enough to see the tracking of his finger. The cold radiating from the glass bit at her cheek, a sharp contrast to the ambient heat of the carriage. She studied the line. "But the road curves toward the eastern ridge," she observed quietly, her mind already pulling up the regional transit maps she had memorized in the archives. "It curves," he agreed. He drew a sharp downward angle, cutting across the horizontal line. Water beaded at the edge of his drawing, dripping slowly down the pane like a heavy tear. "This is the Blackridge incline. For the next 15 miles, The terrain forces the King's Road to intersect with the territorial boundaries established under the old warlord pacts. Garrick's garrison patrols the western ridge, and his militia monitors the toll gates. Evelyn traced the geometry of the situation in her mind. Her administrative training took over, automatically cataloguing the legal precedents of border disputes and overlapping jurisdictions. The grey zone. If the carriage stops there, territorial law supersedes royal transit immunity. Darius stopped drawing and turned his head to look at her. The ambient light from the carriage lanterns caught the severe, intelligent angles of his jaw. Precisely. If my driver halts the horses for any reason before we clear the upper pass, we are technically parking on land governed by regional edict. Garrick's men would have the legal right to approach, demand identification, and search the vehicle for fugitives or contraband. He wiped the condensation away with the heel of his palm, erasing the makeshift map and leaving a streak of clear, dark glass. Beyond it, the rain lashed against the pane in violent diagonal sheets, obscuring the pine trees into black, jagged blurs. That is why the doors remain locked. That is why we do not stop for a fallen tree, a washed-out bridge, or a toll inspector until we cross the Blackridge meridian. To stop is to grant them legal standing. Evelyn let the information settle into her thoughts, solid and immovable. It was a tactical absolute. He was not keeping her inside the carriage out of a desire to control her movements, or force an arrogant proximity. He was using the physical momentum of the wheels to shield them both from a bureaucratic vulnerability. She nodded once, a minimal, controlled tilt of her chin, accepting the logical terms of their confinement. As the carriage began the steep, grinding ascent into the Blackridge incline, the weather deteriorated from a heavy storm into a blinding deluge. The wind howled against the reinforced wooden frame, a low, mournful sound that seemed to press inward on the cabin, rattling the iron hinges. Inside, a heavy, absolute quiet descended. Neither of them spoke for the next 10 miles. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her spine straight, her breathing regulated and deliberately shallow. She had spent years mastering the art of invisibility in the registry halls, learning how to exist in the margins of a room without drawing the eye of the powerful. Yet, sharing this confined space with the Alpha King required a completely different kind of endurance. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. It was dense, pressurized, and deeply physical, demanding a constant hypervigilance to maintain her posture. She listened to the rhythmic creaking of the carriage leather as the chassis fought the muddy incline. Every lurch of the vehicle, every sharp snap of the reins from the driver above, was magnified in the stillness. She could hear the distinct, even rhythm of the sovereign's breathing across the narrow aisle. He did not fidget. He did not adjust his heavy fur-lined cloak or tap his fingers impatiently against his knee. He occupied the silence without apology, lacking the nervous impulse that drove lesser men to fill empty air with useless conversation. Evelyn found her gaze drifting to the steady rise and fall of his chest, then quickly lowered her eyes back to the brass clasps of her briefcase. She focused heavily on the tangible sensory details of her environment to ground her racing calculations, the smell of wet wool radiating from her own damp skirts, the sharp, resinous scent of pine oil and cold iron that clung to the king's coat, the metallic tang of ozone leaking in from the storm outside, mixing with the faint scent of old parchment escaping the heavy leather-bound register in her lap. Mile after brutal mile ground beneath the iron-banded wheels. The tension in the cabin was not born of threat or coercion, but of acute proximity. They were two highly controlled, observant people trapped in a wooden box, hurtling through the dark over enemy lines. Evelyn kept her hands neatly folded, her fingers overlapping the worn leather cover of her family's book. Her knuckles ached slightly from the deep chill seeping through the floorboards, but she refused to rub them together. Showing physical discomfort felt like a breach of professional protocol. A crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed over years of surviving Garrick's cruelty. "Are you cold?" Darius asked. The suddenness of his low voice did not startle her, though it finally broke the long stretch of quiet. He did not move to offer her his cloak, nor did he attempt to cross the physical distance between their seats. He merely asked a question, expecting a factual answer. "No." Evelyn lied quietly, her tone completely even. Darius looked at her hands, observing the slight whitening of her knuckles, then shifted his gaze to the rigid alignment of her shoulders. He did not call her a liar or demand she accept his pity. Instead, he simply reached over and adjusted a small brass lever mounted on the floorboard near his heavy boot. A moment later, a wave of residual heat from the carriage's lower brazier vented into the cabin, slowly warming the air around her frozen skirts and thawing the stiffness in her hands. He leaned back into the shadows of his seat, returning his unhurried observation to the dark, rain-streaked window. The silence resumed its heavy vigil, but the biting edge of the cold slowly receded, replaced by the steady, mechanical warmth of a sovereign who noticed the vital details everyone else ignored. Even with the brass lever engaged, the steep incline of the mountain road changed the fundamental rhythm of their travel and forced the carriage to work harder against the elements. The heavy wheels ground against loose gravel and deep ruts of mud, the suspension groaning. Outside the cabin, the ambient temperature dropped sharply as they climbed, a fierce chill pressing against the reinforced glass and biting at the damp fabric of Evelyn's hem whenever the draft found a seam. The air shifted into a mixture of wet iron, bruised pine needles, and the sharp ozone of a high-altitude storm. Through the rain-streaked glass, the harsh, flickering orange of pitch-soaked torches cut through the fog. Evelyn did not gasp. She had spent enough of her life learning not to tremble in front of people who would only use it against her. Lowering her chin a fraction of an inch, she locked her gaze on the dull brass door handle and tracked the rhythm of her breathing. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 4. She forced her lungs to expand slowly, refusing to let adrenaline hijack her composure. Her years working quietly in the damp registry archives had committed every topographical map and border manifest to her memory. They were at the narrowest choke point of the northern pass, an isolated toll gate currently manned by a beta loyal entirely to Garrick. It was the perfect place to intercept a fleeing woman, legally ambiguous enough to mask an abduction as a routine administrative hold. Evelyn had processed the very ledgers that funded this garrison. She knew exactly how Garrick used it to control his territory. The rhythmic drumming of rain was suddenly underscored by the clatter of spiked wooden barricades dragged across mud and stone. Sharp barks of authority echoed off the ravine walls, demanding an immediate halt. The carriage shuddered violently as the driver pulled back on the reins, the heavy, reinforced vehicle rocking to a complete standstill. Not because she was panicked, but because she understood the corrupt mechanics of Garrick's bureaucracy. Evelyn's knuckles whitened against her lap. Silence fell, replaced only by the hissing downpour and the snorting of exhausted horses. In the dim interior, Darius Vorn remained an immovable anchor of calm. The flickering torchlight cast shifting shadows across his face, yet his posture had not changed since they began the ascent. He made no grab for a weapon, nor did he lean forward to inspect the threat. He merely sat with his broad hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the locked door with the detached interest of a sovereign observing a minor irregularity in his own court. Heavy boots marched toward the carriage, the mud producing a distinct, wet, sucking sound. Evelyn instinctively counted the uneven cadence. There were at least 6 of them. Their movements lacked the disciplined uniformity of the king's guard. These were local enforcers, regional thugs emboldened by the darkness and the isolation of the mountain pass. A gauntleted fist slammed against the reinforced wood of the carriage door. The impact rattled the brass hinges, sending a tremor through the floorboards. "Halt in the name of the regional garrison," a rough, muffled voice shouted through the insulated walls. "This vehicle is under inspection. We have a signed warrant to search all northbound transport for undeclared cargo and a missing archivist. Open the shutters and state your business." Evelyn's breath caught, an involuntary hitch she quickly suppressed. A missing archivist. The phrase lodged in her mind like a sliver of cold glass. Garrick had not reported her as a runaway bride, which would have drawn unwanted attention to his fraudulent marriage contracts. Instead, he had filed her disappearance as a matter of administrative theft. It was a clever bureaucratic fiction, giving his men the legal pretext to tear apart any transport without waiting for sovereign approval. She looked across the narrow space, expecting the king to react with the explosive violence that characterized every powerful man she had ever known when challenged. Darius did nothing of the sort. He sat perfectly still in the freezing shadows. He did not reach for the brass latch or raise his voice to declare his rank. He let the aggressive demand hang in the cold air, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy, uncomfortable, and entirely his own. "Open the carriage!" The voice bellowed again, louder, yet tinged with a sharp edge of uncertainty. The fist pounded a second time, the blows faster, lacking their initial confident rhythm. Still, the king waited. The silence inside the cabin was a physical weight pressing outward against the storm. He was establishing the geometry of the encounter without a single word. By refusing to answer, he forced the rogue soldiers to stand in the freezing rain, their assumed authority eroding with every passing second that the carriage remained a sealed vault. A third knock came, hesitant and awkward against the wet wood. I said, "By order of the garrison." The guard's voice faltered, his bluster leaking into the howling wind. The men outside were beginning to realize that whoever sat inside the pitch-black carriage was not afraid, and their own vulnerability grew the longer they stood in the mud. Evelyn felt the tight, cold knot in her stomach shift. She had spent her life navigating the performative dominance of men like Garrick, men who needed to shout and use force to prove their rank. Watching Darius Vorn weaponize absolute stillness was a revelation. He was not ignoring the men outside. He was demonstrating with terrifying precision that their bluster meant absolutely nothing against true structural power. The carriage shuddered as the horses stamped in the freezing mud, restless under the relentless downpour. Rain lashed the reinforced glass, blurring the garrison's lanterns into smeared streaks of yellow. Beyond the thick leather panels, the rogue guard captain's voice rose again in a grating demand, desperately attempting to salvage his authority by insisting on searching the vehicle for a missing archivist. Evelyn did not shrink back against the velvet upholstery. She sat perfectly upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the heavy brass handle. The mechanical click that had sealed her inside was still fresh in her mind. A physical barrier against the corrupt bureaucracy waiting in the storm. Darius sat opposite her, an anchor of dark fabric and unhurried stillness. He did not draw a weapon. He simply watched her, waiting to see how she would calculate the geometry of the threat. Evelyn closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the ambient noise fade. She did not pray for a miraculous escape. Instead, she descended into the meticulously organized architecture of her own memory. She visualized the cavernous lower vaults of the registry office, the damp chill of the stone walls, the scent of cedar wood and decaying binding glue. She summoned a specific ledger, the provincial treaty governing the mountain pass. Volume 4, bound in cracked green leather. She remembered the exact gravity of the text, recorded in cheap iron gall ink that had browned into the porous parchment over decades. Leaning forward, she closed the physical distance just enough to ensure her voice would not carry beyond the glass. The Vorn-Thorn provincial agreement of the third cycle. Evelyn whispered, her tone steady. Section 4, paragraph 2. It explicitly states that any diplomatic conveyance bearing the royal crest and carrying sealed sovereign mail is unconditionally exempt from regional customs inspections and localized search warrants. Darius kept his gaze locked on her face. The temperature inside seemed to drop, crystallizing around her precise recitation. If they breach that door, Evelyn continued, the phrasing of the municipal code pressing into her memory like a seal into hot wax, they are not committing a simple trespass. Under that treaty, forcing entry into a sovereign mail coach is legally classified as a direct act of treason against the High Keep. The original document is housed in the eastern wing of the regional archive. It has never been repealed. She offered him no magic, no brute force. Her weapon was entirely administrative. It was an absolute, devouring quiet, the sort that consumes any need for further explanation. Darius processed the structural perfection of her defense, the subtle shift in his posture, a slight relaxing of his broad shoulders, a slow blink of profound respect, spoke louder than any declaration. He nodded once, accepting the legal ammunition she had handed him. Darius shifted his weight, his movement deliberate and devoid of urgency. He did not slam his fist against the interior panels. Instead, he reached toward the slotted communication panel set into the reinforced wood near the driver's box. When he spoke, his resonant baritone cut through the howling wind with absolute clarity. He adopted Evelyn's precise legal diction. By the authority of the Vorn-Thorn provincial agreement of the third cycle, Darius stated, the timbre of his voice vibrating against the floorboards. Section 4, paragraph 2. This is a sovereign diplomatic conveyance carrying sealed mail. Any attempt to force entry constitutes a direct act of treason against the High Keep. Outside, the rain briefly masked the guard captain's response. Then came a scoff, laced with bravado, though the underlying hesitation was palpable. The captain demanded physical proof of the exemption, insisting on looking upon the face of the passenger making such claims in the dark. Darius refrained from grabbing the door latch. Slowly, he unclasped the heavy leather glove from his right hand. Pulling it free finger by finger from the pocket of his dark wool coat, he withdrew the royal sovereign seal. The cold iron signet ring absorbed the amber light of the lantern. It was a pragmatic instrument of statecraft, scarred by years of pressing into hot wax to dictate the fates of thousands. Darius leaned toward the narrow pane of the carriage door. The glass was frosted with condensation. Without a word, he wiped a small, perfect circle clear with his thumb. He raised his hand and pressed the deeply engraved face of the heavy signet directly against the cold pane. The cold iron clinked sharply against the glass. Through the rain-streaked window, the captain raised his lantern closer. The sputtering yellow flame caught the intricate crest carved into the metal, the unmistakable, towering wolf motif of the sovereign king. The transformation in the captain's posture was immediate. His arrogant slump vanished, replaced by rigid certainty. He stared at the seal, his eyes widening as the legal reality crashed down upon him. The man holding the ring was not merely quoting the law. He was the living embodiment of it. Slowly, the captain bowed his head. The rain plastered his matted hair to his face as he took a deliberate step backward into the churning mud, yielding the road. He turned sharply, barking a frantic order to the men operating the checkpoint. The massive wooden toll gate began to creak upward on its rusted chains, groaning against the storm. Darius pulled his hand back, the cold iron, leaving a faint impression in the residual frost. He slipped the ring into his pocket and pulled his glove over his knuckles, smoothing the material with methodical care. The carriage jerked slightly as the driver cracked the reins. The horses strained against the harness, pulling the solid wheels out of the mud and forward into the dark mountain pass. Evelyn remained still, letting that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. She exhaled a measured breath, the tension leaving her spine one vertebra at a time. The door remained locked. The law had held, and the man sitting across from her had defended her not with violence, but with the very ledgers she had dedicated her life to protecting. The heavy iron-rimmed wheels of the royal carriage caught the slick gravel of the mountain pass, surging forward as the toll gate vanished into the dark rain behind them. Evelyn maintained her perfectly straight posture against the tufted leather seat. She did not exhale a heavy sigh. She did not lean her head against the frosted glass of the window. The survival instinct that had kept her voice steady during the legal confrontation was now receding, pulling away like a retreating tide and leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. It was not the kind of tiredness that required sleep, but rather the sharp, physiological consequence of holding a rigid line against armed men. Her core temperature seemed to drop. The chill of the northern wind outside began to seep through her damp wool skirts. She looked down at the open wooden travel briefcase on her lap, where the ancestral record rested beneath her clerical supplies. The brass latches gleamed faintly in the low light of the swinging carriage lantern. She needed to put things away. She needed to establish order, to rely on the mechanical repetition of archiving to anchor her mind. She reached for the spare brass ink nib resting on the velvet ledge of the box. Her fingers refused the command. The tremor began in her wrists, a violent involuntary shaking that she could neither hide nor suppress. The small brass piece slipped from her grasp, tumbling toward the floorboards. It never hit the wood. Darius Vorn moved with a predatory economy of motion that defied the cramped, shifting space of the cabin. His large gloved hand snapped out, catching the tiny brass point in mid-air before she could even flinch. For a long, strained second, neither of them moved. She stared at his large knuckles, bracing herself for the inevitable commentary, the patronizing question about her nerves, or the sudden assertion of dominance that most men used to mask their discomfort. Instead, the king simply turned his wrist and placed the ink nib carefully back into its designated velvet slot. He withdrew his hand, settling deep into the shadows of his seat. He did not ask if she was well. He did not tell her to calm down. He occupied the quiet space of the carriage without the nervous impulse to speak, granting her the dignity of recovering her composure without an audience. He simply gave her the space to breathe, his gaze directed toward the dark window, acting as a shield rather than a spotlight. The carriage swayed heavily as they took a sharp curve, but the absolute stillness of the sovereign anchored the shifting room. Evelyn pressed her palms flat against the sturdy leather of her briefcase. The trembling slowly subsided, absorbed by the quiet safety he had deliberately manufactured. The silence held for another mile, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the ceaseless drumming of the rain against the roof. When Evelyn finally shifted, the immediate threat of the border guard was gone, but the structural reality of her life remained. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron, her fingers seeking out the one item that was not a legal document, a wax seal, or a contract. She withdrew a small, folded linen handkerchief, setting it gently atop the heavy cover of the ledger. Carefully, as if handling spun glass, she peeled back the edges of the cloth. Resting in the center was a small, roughly carved wooden toy. It was meant to be a hound, though the cheap pine was uneven and the knife marks were clumsy. It was the work of hands that were too frail to properly grip a blade. Darius shifted his focus from the window to the object. He did not dismiss it as a child's trinket. He looked at the crude piece of wood with the same intense analytical calculation he had applied to the forged border records. "Pip," she said, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the storm. "My younger brother." She kept her eyes on the wooden hound, her thumb tracing the uneven line of its back. Garrick Thorn controls the regional network in the lower wards. He manages the market access, the transit writs, the housing registries. I could walk away from my stolen inheritance. I could walk into the winter and disappear entirely. But Pip is still in the district. He is frail. He watches everything, but he cannot run. The reality of her situation surfaced, not in tears, but in a cold, quiet recitation of logistics. If I am not there, Garrick will leverage the boy. He will use the local bureaucracy to reclassify him as an abandoned ward. I cannot leave him under Garrick's jurisdiction. He did not immediately offer a soothing platitude. He studied her, registering the exact nature of her vulnerability and the tactical weight of her problem. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate directly through the floorboards. He will not remain under Thorn's jurisdiction. Darius leaned forward slightly, the heavy fur collar of his cloak shifting. When we reach the high keep, the boy will be brought across the border under sovereign escort. I will sign the extraction decree myself. He will be designated as a royal dependent under my direct protection. Evelyn looked up, her breath catching at the absolute certainty in his posture. He was not offering to fight Garrick in a senseless tavern brawl. He was offering to dismantle Garrick's legal hold over her family entirely. "Formal protection," Darius added, holding her gaze with a steady, unyielding respect. "No one touches what belongs in my archives, and no one threatens the family of the woman who just secured my carriage." Evelyn looked back down at the wooden hound, her shoulders, rigid since they had departed the toll gate, finally lowered a fraction of an inch, letting in the first faint light of genuine safety. The brass lantern bolted to the carriage ceiling swung with the rhythm of the uneven mountain road, casting a weak, trembling yellow light across the narrow cabin. Evelyn carefully wrapped the small wooden toy back into her handkerchief. Resolving to stay useful, she pulled out the estate's central folio once more and rested it on her knees. The thick parchment pages were cold and stiff under her ink-stained fingers. As the carriage plunged deeper into the storm, she spent the next hour cross-referencing the estate transfers. The scratching sound of dry vellum turning filled the space, weaving beneath the steady grinding of the wooden wheels against the mud. She focused entirely on the columns of numbers and the erratic sweeps of signatures at the bottom of the contracts. Garrick had been thorough in his financial theft, but he had not been careful. She leaned closer to the trembling light, her eyes narrowing as the vehicle hit another rut. She did not look for grandiose conspiracies. She looked for structural, administrative inconsistencies. She counted the fraudulent marks with silent, methodical precision. 1, 2, 7, 14. 14 separate deeds of land transfer, all finalized within the impossible span of 3 weeks. She pressed the pad of her thumb against the darkest part of the last signature. The ink did not possess the deep, velvety blackness of the standard iron gall required by the Northern Registry. It was a cheap, hastily prepared oak gall dye. She recognized the faint, acidic scent of it, a bitter, oxidized smell of wet bark that lingered even after the parchment had completely dried. The cheap pigment flaked at the edges of the cursive loops, leaving a rust-colored halo around the heavy strokes. That specific oak gall mixture was common only in the eastern estates, where the acidic soil yielded poor timber and cheap tannins. No official border magistrate would ever use it for a binding regional treaty. She pulled her own quill from her travel case, checking the split tip for damage. Her movements were sharp and measured, driven by the mechanical need to document the truth before the cold exhaustion of the night could drag her under. She catalogued the discrepancies in her notebook, recording every overlapping land transfer and every rusted edge of false ink. When the carriage jolted violently, she did not gasp. She simply waited for the swaying to settle, smoothed the wrinkled page with the heel of her palm, and dipped her pen again. From the opposite bench, Darius observed the precise, unbroken rhythm of her labor. He sat entirely still in the shadows, a dark silhouette against the grey window glass. He had watched many individuals react to the pressure of the road and the threat of rogue militia. Most demanded physical reassurance, most panicked. Evelyn simply counted ink strokes and catalogued fraud. "You have found the flaw in the architecture," Darius said quietly. His voice did not break the silence so much as it layered beneath it, calm and devoid of the performative dominance other alphas relied upon. Evelyn finished her sentence, dotted the final margin note, and then slowly raised her head. 14 flaws, she corrected, her tone dry and matter-of-fact. He used Eastern dye on northern parchment. The acidity is already eating through the vellum. In 10 years, these signatures will burn their own holes into the records. But for now, they simply look cheap. Darius leaned forward slightly, the faint lantern light catching the exhausted angles of his jaw. He looked at the heavy book on her lap, and for a rare moment, the sovereign let the armor of his absolute authority slip into something resembling pure, unglamorous fatigue. "They always believe power is found in the grand gestures," the king murmured, his gaze resting on her ink-stained fingers. "In bloodlines and witness circles, they forget that an empire is actually sustained by the tedious, invisible labor of keeping the records straight." She watched him carefully, noting the way his broad shoulders relaxed just a fraction of an inch against the leather squabs. "I have spent my entire reign drowning in paper," Darius continued, his voice dropping into a quiet, pragmatic confession. "The crown is not a glorious seat of power, Evelyn. It is merely a very large, very complicated filing cabinet of debts, grievances, and broken treaties. Every regional leader who visits my hall wants to speak of destiny and conquest. None of them want to audit the grain supply for the winter." Evelyn let her hands rest flat against the open pages of the ledger. She felt a strange, solidifying shift in the cabin's atmosphere. He was not speaking to her as a rescued Omega or a temporary ward. He was speaking to her as a fellow custodian of a broken system. "Is that why you enforce the border laws so strictly?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "To keep the cabinet organized." "I use the strict structure of the law as a shield," he admitted, looking out at the driving rain before turning his eyes back to her. "A contract of convenience, a rigid border treaty, a locked carriage door. They are not meant to imprison. They are meant to keep the arrogant chaos out, so that the necessary work can be done." He never extended his arm across the narrow space for her hand. He did not offer empty romantic platitudes about protecting her forever. Instead, he offered her the profound respect of acknowledging her specific, practical intelligence. He recognized that she survived through quiet observation, just as he survived through meticulous administration. Evelyn looked down at her handwritten notebook, the tight defensive knot in her chest loosening just a fraction. She did not need a glorious savior with a sword. She needed someone who understood the critical value of the correct ink. She picked up her quill, tapped off the excess dye, and went back to her counting, no longer feeling quite so alone in the cold. The rhythmic thud of the autumn storm against the leather roof was suddenly broken by a sharp, metallic clatter. It did not come from the muddy road, but from the exterior paneling of the carriage itself. The heavy sound of hooves pulled parallel to their moving wheels for only a fraction of a second, just long enough for a relay courier to match their speed in the blinding rain. A mechanism engaged. Something heavy slid down the internal brass chute built into the reinforced wall of the carriage, dropping into the receiving tray with a dull thud. Darius left his weapons untouched. His unhurried movements remained perfectly steady as he leaned forward, unlatching the small iron grate covering the tray. A copper courier tube rolled into his palm. It was slick with rainwater and smelled faintly of ozone, wet brass, and the exhausted sweat of a hard-ridden horse. He twisted the heavy cap. The sound of metal grinding on metal filled the enclosed space, a harsh contrast to the steady drumming of the storm. From within the protective casing, he extracted a pale, solid cylinder of sealing wax. The sharp scent of burnt tallow and pine resin immediately overpowered the damp, cold air of the carriage interior. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her eyes tracking the object. Darius turned the wax over in his gloved hands, inspecting the flat end, before offering it toward the center of the leather bench. He held it carefully, so she could see the insignia pressed into the base. It was the official mark of the archive Phoebus, a raven perched over an open ledger. She leaned slightly forward. The dim, swaying light of the carriage lantern cast erratic shadows over the pale wax, throwing the raised edges of the seal into sharp relief. Evelyn's breath caught, a quiet intake of air that she immediately forced down into her lungs. The raven had 2 sets of wings. The ledger possessed an echoed, overlapping rim. It was a double stamp. Letting that knowledge settle into her chest like a stone dropping through still water, Evelyn studied the fractured lines. Moira Finch never wasted wax. In the freezing stone vaults of the registry, the older woman had taught Evelyn the exact, measured pressure required to leave a clean, singular mark. Moira was a creature of absolute bureaucratic precision. A double stamp was a severe, nearly impossible breach of protocol. This was not a mistake born of haste. It was a deliberate, mechanical error, a silent alarm pressed into the very medium of their profession. It meant someone was standing directly over Moira's shoulder when the hot tallow was poured. It meant Garrick's enforcers had already breached the lower registry in their hunt for the missing ledger. The wax had been slightly too cool on the second strike, causing a micro-fracture along the raven's left wing, a physical record of Moira's deliberate hesitation under pressure. The physical reality of the threat became undeniable. Thorn was not merely searching the local roads. He was actively dismantling the administrative safeguard she had left behind. The warning was not written on parchment. The encrypted message was carved directly into the curved surface of the wax cylinder, utilizing a method known only to the senior clerks of the archive. It required the lantern's specific angle to cast shadows into the microscopic grooves, transforming the pinprick scratches into legible administrative shorthand. Darius held the cylinder up toward the brass lantern, swinging gently from the roof. The angle was wrong. The shadows remained flat against the pale wax, refusing to reveal the depth of the meticulous cuts. "The light needs to strike the deeper incisions directly," he murmured. His voice was a low, even cadence that cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the storm outside. He shifted slightly on his side of the bench, making space without issuing a command or demanding her compliance. Evelyn did not hesitate. She slid across the damp, tufted upholstery until she was sitting beside him, sharing the narrow, illuminated workspace beneath the swaying glass. The carriage hit a deep rut in the flooded road. The heavy chassis jolted violently, pitching the interior sideways. Her shoulder brushed against his. The thick, dry wool of his sovereign coat met the damp, fraying linen of her sleeve. Darius did not flinch away, nor did he adjust his posture to trap her in the confined space. He simply held his ground, providing a steady, immovable anchor against the violent motion of the carriage. He respected the boundary of her physical space by offering stability rather than possession. She raised her hand, her fingertips coming to rest lightly against the opposite edge of the wax cylinder to help him stabilize it. His knuckles were warm. The freezing draft that seeped through the carriage floorboards seemed to stop an inch from his frame. Together, moving with deliberate care, they rotated the cylinder millimeter by millimeter beneath the flickering flame. The shadows finally aligned. The Jagger organized it into rigid bureaucratic code. Evelyn's eyes tracked the lines, her mind instantly translating the shorthand. Militia mobilized, she read aloud, her tone flat and analytical. Main river crossing blockaded. Forged warrants issued under regional beta authority. She calculated the geography in her head, referencing the heavy maps she had memorized over the years. The bridge was the only legal, structurally sound crossing point into the sovereign's direct jurisdiction. Garrick had not sent a chaotic mob or a lawless assassination squad. He had weaponized the local bureaucracy, sending a deputized militia under the guise of tax enforcement to trap them at the narrowest choke point on the mountain. If Thorn was issuing forged warrants, he was using the exact legal loopholes documented in the ledger currently sitting in her bag. Darius absorbed the tactical threat in absolute stillness. A muscle feathered along his jaw, the only physical betrayal of his displeasure. He did not curse the corrupt beta, nor did he knock on the ceiling to demand the driver increase their speed. He occupied the silence, letting the reality of the forged warrants settle over the small space. Seeing the law twisted into a weapon clearly offended the very core of his sovereignty. The shared tension in the carriage shifted irreversibly. They were no longer merely a fugitive and a protector, sitting on opposite sides of a locked door. Over a cylinder of scarred wax and the faint warmth of a shared lantern, their proximity had forged a quiet, tactical collaboration. This silent alliance was tested. Moments later, when the leather cab tipped backward slightly, as the horses were pulled to a sudden, violent stop. Outside, the relentless autumn rain drummed against the reinforced roof, but beneath that familiar rhythm came a new sound, the heavy, synchronized thud of iron-shod boots on wet timber. They had reached the crossing. The narrow span of the mountain bridge was the only route deeper into the sovereign jurisdiction, and it was entirely blocked. Evelyn did not gasp or shrink back into the upholstery. Instead, her spine straightened against the velvet squabs, her eyes calibrating to the sudden bloom of yellow lantern light pressing against the rain-streaked glass. Darius sat perfectly still beside her, his presence an anchoring weight in the freezing cabin. He kept his hands entirely still, making no move for his blade. He merely observed the shifting shadows outside. A fist slammed into the exterior of the heavy panel, shaking the frame. A muffled voice, made rough by the weather, ordered the driver to stand down. Then a face appeared at the glass. A militia captain, wearing the dark grey insignia of Garrick Thorn's provincial guard. The man held up a heavily folded piece of parchment, slapping it flat against the wet window so the occupants could read the bold, aggressive calligraphy. Through the blurred glass, the captain shouted that he held a lawful writ of arrest for a fugitive debtor. The demand was clear. She was to be surrendered immediately for financial crimes against the local governance. For a fraction of a second, the cold air in the carriage seemed to evaporate. Then, the young woman leaned forward. She did not look at the angry face of the militia captain, nor did she look at the weapons strapped to his belt. Her attention locked entirely onto the bottom corner of the parchment, pressed against the glass. The dim lantern light from outside illuminated the wax seal anchoring the writ. It was a heavy, mottled crimson, stamped with a laurel wreath and a standard provincial crest. Her eyes tracked the ridges of the wax. Her mind catalogued the specific impression, cross-referencing it with 5 years of exhausting, meticulous archive labor. A bead of condensation rolled down the inside of the window pane, temporarily blurring the image, but she had already seen enough. "That is not a valid warrant," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet space of the carriage. Her tone was not defensive, but purely analytical. Look at the outer edge of the wax. It carries the dual laurel stamp of the Southeast Registry. The king shifted his gaze from the captain to her profile, waiting for the conclusion. That office was decommissioned 3 years ago, Evelyn continued, the steady rhythm of her breath returning. Their seals were supposed to be destroyed when the central administration consolidated the tax districts. Garrick is using a dead office's seal to draft ghost warrants. Under sovereignty law, that document is legally void. He did not offer a small smile of encouragement, nor did he praise her with empty words. The sovereign simply nodded, accepting her administrative assessment as absolute, undeniable fact. He reached slowly to his side and unlatched the heavy window mechanism. The glass slid down with a sharp mechanical scrape, letting in a blast of freezing wind and the overwhelming scent of wet pine and damp iron armor. The militia leader puffed up his chest, preparing to shout his demands again, but the words died in his throat. The interior of the cab was deliberately kept dark, but the man recognized the sheer, oppressive gravity of the ruler sitting in the shadows. Without a word, Darius lifted the leather-bound registry from the seat between them. The heavy, leather-bound register landed on the window ledge with a solid, echoing thud that seemed to cut through the noise of the rushing river below. He flipped the cover open, his gloved fingers turning the thick pages with unhurried precision until he found the exact column the archivist had audited hours earlier. "You stand on a sovereign highway, enforcing a void writ from a defunct registry," he stated. His voice was a low, even current that required no volume to command the night. "And you claim a debt that was settled in full, as recorded in this exact ledger signed by the provincial magistrate himself." The captain swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the impassive face in the dark to the dense lines of ink on the exposed page. The man tried to stammer a defense, attempting to cite his employer's authority, but his bravado was rapidly dissolving into the freezing rain. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his helmet, splashing uselessly against the thick wooden frame. To end the dispute, the king raised his left hand, resting it flat against the edge of the open book. The militia lanterns caught the heavy cold iron signet on his finger. The royal sovereign seal. It was not a symbol of brute force, but the ultimate, structural manifestation of the law itself. To detain a royal carriage using a forged legal document is not a minor infraction, Darius continued, the absolute calm in his tone far more terrifying than a shouted threat. "It is high treason against the crown. You have exactly 10 seconds to decide if you wish to face the tribunal for Thorn's crimes, or if you will clear my bridge." The captain stared at the cold iron ring, the color draining entirely from his weather-beaten face. He looked at the meticulous ledger, then at the dead seal on his own useless parchment. The calculation in his mind was swift and devastating. He took a rapid, stumbling step backward, ripping the forged writ away from the carriage window. With a frantic wave of his arm, the captain began shouting orders at his men, his voice cracking with panic. The soldiers scrambled, hauling the heavy wooden barricades out of the mud and backing their horses away from the timber span. They moved with desperate haste, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic legal error they had just committed. Darius calmly pulled the glass window back up, sealing out the wind and the rain. The heavy mechanical latch clicked into place, securing the cabin once more. Outside, the path was clear. The heavy iron-rimmed wheels of the royal carriage transitioned from the hollow, echoing thud of the wooden bridge to the solid, unyielding strike of paved stone to Evelyn. That sound was a geographical and legal marker. The border of the northern sovereign territory was not merely an inked line on the maps she had studied. It was a concrete physical texture beneath them. Behind them lay the lawless mud of the mountain pass, the rogue garrisons, and the corrupt reach of Garrick Thorn. Ahead lay the absolute, documented jurisdiction of the Alpha King. The relentless drumming of the autumn storm, which had battered the lacquered roof of the coach for hours, finally began to thin. The heavy sheets of grey rain dissolved into a fine, drifting mist. The air inside the cabin, previously tight, with the suffocating tension of the standoff, slowly decompressed. Evelyn moved. Her limbs felt incredibly heavy, weighed down by the adrenaline crash of the confrontation and the long, agonizing hours of cross-referencing ledgers in near darkness. She reached for the brass toggles securing the thick leather blind over her window. The leather was stiff from the biting cold, the buckles stubbornly tight against the dampness, but her fingers worked the metal free with practiced, methodical patience. She did not ask for assistance. She simply unfastened the straps, rolled the heavy hide upward, and secured it to the ceiling hook. The damp, freezing morning air immediately washed into the enclosed space of the carriage. It smelled of crushed pine needles, wet granite, and the sharp, clean bite of ozone. Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned slightly toward the open frame. The pale, watery sunlight of the early dawn filtered through the mist, casting long shadows across her exhausted face. It was not a warm sun. It was the pale, indifferent light of the deep north, but it felt remarkably like an armor she no longer had to carry. She did not lean entirely out of the window, maintaining her careful, upright posture on the velvet seat, but she let the cold wind strip the stale warmth from her skin. For the past 24 hours, basic survival had demanded a hypervigilance that tightened every muscle in her neck and back. Now, the absolute stillness of the territory beyond the bridge demanded nothing. The King's roads were famously secure, maintained by strict patrols and unyielding transit laws. There would be no more forged warrants shoved through the carriage window. The silence outside was no longer a threat hiding men in the dark. It was just the natural, quiet respiration of the wilderness. Darius watched her. He did not intrude on the moment, allowing her the full measure of the damp morning air before he spoke. His voice, when it finally broke the quiet, remained low and entirely devoid of the patronizing cadence her former pursuers had always favored. "The High Keep is less than an hour away," he stated, his gaze resting on the organized stack of parchment still sitting beside her travel briefcase. "Mora Finch will have the archives prepared for our arrival. The border registries are, as you accurately noted, in severe disarray." Evelyn pulled herself back from the window. She did not slump against the cushions in relief. Instead, she straightened her spine, smoothing the wrinkles from her damp skirt with ink-stained fingers. The immediate physical danger was over, but the question of her survival in an entirely new political ecosystem remained. She was a fugitive from a fraudulent marriage contract, currently traveling under the sovereign custody of the Alpha King. Custody, however protective, was still a form of control. Protection was a debt, and she did not tolerate debts. "If I am to untangle the northern registries," Evelyn said, her voice steady and deliberate, "we must clarify the precise nature of my presence at the keep." Darius shifted slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. The carriage swayed gently as it navigated a sweeping bend in the stone road. "I am listening. I require a formal employment contract," she said, her hands resting calmly on the brass latch of her briefcase. "I will not be housed as a political ward, a displaced Omega, or a charitable guest. I expect standard wages for a senior archivist. My working hours will be strictly defined, dawn until dusk, with the exception of royal emergencies. I require my own lodgings, independent of the main residential wing, and my brother Pip will be accommodated with me. Furthermore, my access to the lower vaults must be unrestricted." She held his gaze, waiting for the inevitable pushback. Powerful men rarely accepted conditions from women who possessed nothing but a heavy ledger. They expected unquestioning obedience in exchange for their shelter. He absorbed the stillness with the same natural dominance he applied to a courtroom, entirely untroubled by the pause. He studied the sharp line of her jaw and the tactical competence in her eyes. He did not look at her as a rescued victim, but as a highly capable asset negotiating her worth. "Standard wages for a senior archivist," Darius repeated smoothly, his tone perfectly level, "are 12 silver marks a month. You will find the independent quarters near the Eastern Garden drafty, but acceptable for you and your brother. As for your hours, if I find you in the archives past dusk, I will assume you are violating your own terms." Evelyn let her breath escape slowly. He was not mocking her. There was a dry, pragmatic respect in his tone that settled in her chest like a stone dropping through still water. He was handing her the exact structural safety she demanded, wrapped entirely in the legal binding of an honest day's work. It was not a cage, it was a foundation. "We have an agreement, then," she said softly, reaching out to align the edges of her ledger. "We have a contract, Evelyn." Darius did not reach across the narrow space to touch her hand. He did not need to. The boundary had been explicitly drawn, and for the first time in her life, the man standing on the other side of it had absolutely no intention of crossing it without her permission. By late morning, the iron-rimmed wheels of the carriage transitioned from the wet, treacherous mud of the mountain pass to the perfectly leveled, dry cobblestones of the High Keep's inner courtyard. The rhythmic clatter echoed off high stone walls, signaling an absolute boundary. No unauthorized militia, no corrupt regional guards could ever breach this perimeter. The vehicle slowed, the heavy suspension groaning one final time before coming to a complete and profound halt. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and entirely secure. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Evelyn sat with her spine perfectly straight, her hands resting on the worn leather of her briefcase. The Vance family ledger was safely strapped inside. The frantic, desperate energy that had propelled her through the freezing rain the night before seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the steady reality of the sovereign fortress. Darius looked out the small, condensation-streaked window, observing the layout of his courtyard, before turning his attention back to her. His movements were deliberate, unhurried by the completion of their perilous transit. He reached for the heavy iron latch of the carriage door, the very mechanism that had sealed her inside when she had first made the mistake of boarding his private transport. With a firm metallic slide, he disengaged the lock. He pushed the thick, leather-paneled oak door outward. The crisp, biting air of the northern altitude rushed into the cabin, instantly clearing away the lingering sense of damp wool and drying ink. It smelled of crushed pine needles, cold granite, and burning hearthwood. Darius stepped out into the morning light. The courtyard was vast, meticulously ordered, and surrounded by towering battlements that cast long, protective shadows over the grounds. He turned back to face her, standing in the open doorway. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his gaze. He did not order her out. He did not command her presence. Instead, he spoke with the measured cadence of a ruler, issuing a formal decree of sanctuary. "Your journey with me is over, Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly in the crisp morning air. "Your tenure at my court begins." He reached out to help her descend. As he did, Evelyn noticed a profound shift. Throughout the long night of reviewing fraudulent contracts and verifying wax seals, there had always been a barrier between them. Now, he had removed his heavy riding gloves. He offered her his bare hand. Evelyn stared at his palm for a fraction of a second. She noted the calluses at the base of his fingers, the faint scar crossing his knuckles. The hands of a man who enforced the law not just with decrees, but with physical endurance. Taking a slow, measured breath, she lifted her own hand and placed it within his grip. The contact was grounding. It was the first time their skin had met without the intermediary of leather, paper, or iron. His hold was firm, offering absolute stability without the slightest hint of crushing coercion. He supported her weight seamlessly as she stepped down from the high carriage step, her boots finally making contact with the dry, solid stone of the high keep courtyard. The ground beneath her did not shift. She had arrived. The interior of the fortress was a reflection of the man who commanded it, vast, austere, and impeccably maintained. As Darius guided her through the wide, drafty corridors, Evelyn took in the sensory details of her new environment. The stone walls radiated a deep, ancient chill, but massive fireplaces positioned at regular intervals cast pools of steady warmth. The air smelled of beeswax candles, polished wood, and the faint metallic tang of cold armor worn by the silent guards stationed at the intersections. They ascended a wide spiral staircase and walked down a quiet, high-seasoned hallway located deep within the administrative wing. This was the heart of the sovereign bureaucracy, the place where ledgers and treaties governed the fate of thousands. They stopped before a massive set of double oak doors, reinforced with dark iron bands. Darius turned to face her. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat and withdrew a single heavy iron key. He held it out to her, resting it in the center of his palm. "Mora Finch is expecting you, but this wing requires autonomous oversight," he explained, his tone shifting into the practical register of a sovereign assigning a crucial post. "You will have full jurisdiction over the historical land registries, the border tax ledgers, and the internal audit files. No one enters this space without your explicit authorization. Not the council elders, not the regional marshals." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers with unwavering respect. "Not even me, unless you permit it." Evelyn reached out and took the key. The iron was cold, heavy, and meticulously forged, the teeth cut into a complex, unpickable pattern. She traced the grooves with her thumb, feeling the sharp edges of her new reality. This was a permanent, structural transfer of authority. She had traded a life of invisible servitude and fraudulent marriage contracts for a position of undeniable, documented power. She looked back down the long stone corridor, her mind briefly returning to the dark, rain-swept courtyard where she had blindly thrown herself into a standing carriage. She thought of the empty leather seats, the condensation on the glass, the absolute terror of realizing she was trapped. She looked at the key in her hand and then at the man standing beside her. She was no longer running. She was choosing to stay, actively stepping into the center of the sovereignty. Evelyn stepped toward the heavy oak door and fit the iron key into the lock. The metal slid perfectly into place. She turned her wrist, the heavy internal tumblers aligned, engaging with a firm, resounding click. The sound echoed sharply down the stone hallway. It was a precise, mechanical noise that perfectly mirrored the heavy latch of the carriage door, locking her inside the night before. But this time, she was on the outside, and she was the one controlling the mechanism. This time, the lock did not seal her fate in darkness. It secured her sanctuary. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, lined with towering bookshelves, categorized filing cabinets, and a massive mahogany desk positioned before a roaring hearth. The scent of old parchment, drying ink, and warm pine filled her lungs. Tomorrow she would send a secure royal courier for Pip, bringing him out of the vulnerable borderlands and into the safety of these walls. Evelyn paused on the threshold. She did not rush inside. She turned back to Darius, who remained standing in the corridor, keeping a respectful distance, watching her take ownership of her domain. She met his eyes, offering a quiet, steady nod of acknowledgement. He returned the gesture, a silent promise held between them, before he turned and walked down the hall, leaving her to cross the threshold and close the door on her own terms.